Welcome to What If Sleepstorian, where legends breathe, shadows stir, and what if becomes a lullaby for the curious soul. Here, heroes, villains, and ghostly whispers share the same gaslit streets and moon-soaked rooftops, weaving timeless tales of wonder, dread, and forgotten dreams. So settle in, dim the lights, and let the echoes of another age carry you into sleep. Tonight, our journey begins with something a little more sinister. New Orleans, 1890. The Crescent City sprawls along the Mississippi's muddy curve, a place of contradictions where opulence and decay dance cheek to cheek. This isn't the romanticised New Orleans of Mardi Gras beads and jazz hymns, where revellers sip absinthe under wrought-iron balconies. No, this is a city of sweat and survival, where the air hangs heavy with the reek of river silt, rotting fish, and the sweet decay of magnolias wilting in the heat. The French Quarter's cobblestone streets glisten with spilled rum and rainwater, their cracks alive with moss that thrives in the damp. Gaslights flicker, their glow frail against the encroaching dusk, casting shadows that twist like spirits in the narrow alleys. Beyond the city, the bayou stretches, a labyrinth of cypress knees and black water, where the hum of cicadas drowns out the whispers of things that should not be. The sounds of New Orleans are a living pulse, the clop of mule-drawn carts, their wheels grinding through mud, the shouts of dock workers unloading cotton bales, their voices roar with Creole and Cajun cadences, the mournful wail of a steamboat's whistle, echoing across the river like a lost soul, the air tastes of salt and smoke, the tang of gumbo simmering in iron pots, the bitter edge of chicory coffee brewed too long. But beneath it all lies a sharper scent. Fear, primal and raw, carried on the breeze from the swamps where men vanish and return changed, or not at all. This is a city of faith and superstition, where Catholic crosses hang beside voodoo veve, where priests and priestesses alike mutter prayers against the dark. The people move with purpose, their hands rough from labour, stevedores hauling crates, washerwomen scrubbing linens in scalding water, fishermen mending nets that smell of brine and despair. Their faces, black, white, Creole, are etched with the strain of survival, eyes darting to the shadows, ears attuned to the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig. The heat is a weight, pressing against the skin, slicking it with sweat that stings the eyes. Clothing clings, threadbare calico or sweat-stained linen, patched and repatched, a testament to lives eked out day by day. Children play in the streets, their laughter sharp, fleeting, silenced by mothers who clutch grigri bags and whisper of a loup-garou, werewolves whose howls pierce the moonlit nights. This isn't the New Orleans of storybooks, with its genteel plantations and powdered wigs. This is a city of filth and fever, where Yellow Jack lurks in the mosquito's hum, where the river's bounty comes at the cost of broken backs and blistered hands. The wealthy sip juleps in garden district mansions, their silk fans stirring air thick with privilege, but even they bolt their doors at night, their silver candelabras trembling at tales of a cult in the swamps, a cult that worships the beast within, whose rituals leave only bones and blood. The name loup-garou is a blade, whispered in dread, a shadow heavier than the cypress trees. Into this city of heat and haunting steps Professor Abraham Van Helsing, a man whose reputation precedes him like a storm cloud. His name is known in Amsterdam's lecture halls and Transylvania's shadowed villages, a scholar of the occult whose hands have wielded both scalpel and stake. He arrives on a steamboat, the Natchez, its paddle wheel churning the Mississippi's murky waters, its deck slick with river spray. The docks are a chaos of barrels and bales, the air thick with the shouts of men and the creak of ropes. Van Helsing stands apart, his greatcoat too heavy for the Louisiana heat, its wool dusted with ash from the steamer's smokestack. His face is weathered, lined with years of hunting things that defy reason, his eyes sharp, grey as steel, missing nothing. The city watches him, or so it seems. A fisherman pauses, his net half mended, his fingers calloused, his gaze wary. A woman selling pralines under a striped awning narrows her eyes, her hands sticky with sugar, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Van Helsing's presence is a disturbance, a ripple in the city's uneasy truce with the unknown. He carries a leather satchel, its straps worn, its contents heavy. Books, vials, a silver crucifix that glints in the fading light. His boots, scuffed from cobblestone and mud, leave prints in the dock's damp planks, each step deliberate, as if he senses the weight of the task ahead. He has come at the behest of Father Antoine, a Jesuit priest whose letter reached him in London, its pages trembling with urgency. Disappearances plague New Orleans. Men, women, children, vanished from the swamps or the city's edges, their fates unknown but whispered in terror. The locals speak of a cult hidden in the bayou that worships the loup-garou, offering blood to summon the beast's power. The police are useless, their lanterns dim against the swamp's secrets. Father Antoine begs for Van Helsing's expertise, his faith shaken by signs he cannot explain. Claw marks on church doors, howls that silence the night, bodies found torn as if by claws no animal could wield. Van Helsing steps onto the dock, the wood creaking under his weight, the air a slap of heat that steals his breath. His coat clings damp with sweat, and he longs for Amsterdam's cool mists, but duty anchors him here. The letter burns in his mind, Father Antoine's words a litany of dread. They are not men, Professor, not any more. He scans the crowd, his eyes catching the fisherman's stare, the praline seller's prayer. They know something, he thinks, their fear a scent sharper than the river's muck. His satchel is a comfort, its weight a reminder of battles won, vampires in Romania, wraiths in Prague. But werewolves are new, their savagery a puzzle he has yet to solve. The city feels alive, its pulse a drumbeat of danger. The air tastes of salt and decay coating his throat, and he coughs, his hand tightening on the satchel's strap. The sun dips low, painting the sky blood red, and he wonders if it's an omen. His faith, once iron, wavers in this place of mixed gods, where voodoo drums echo from the shadows and crosses hang beside strange charms. He thinks of Dracula, the Count's eyes burning in the dark, and wonders if this cult is his legacy, a new breed of horror. The thought chills him, though the heat presses like a vice. A boy, no older than 10, approaches, his bare feet slapping the dock, his eyes wide, dark as the river. "You the doctor?" he asks, his voice a Creole lilt, his shirt patched, smelling of fish. Van Helsing nods, his smile faint, practiced. "Take me to Father Antoine," he says, his Dutch accent thick, his tone firm but kind. The boy hesitates, his fingers clutching a small pouch at his neck. A gris-gris, Van Helsing notes, its leather worn, its contents unknown. "Follow me," the boy says, darting into the crowd, his steps quick, wary, as if the shadows watch. Van Helsing follows, his boots heavy, the city's chaos swallowing him. The streets narrow, their buildings leaning close, their shutters peeling, their balconies dripping with ferns. The air grows thicker, smelling of jasmine and rot, the heat a weight on his chest. He senses eyes, human perhaps or not, tracking him from alleyways, from behind lace curtains. The boy leads him past a market, its stalls alive with voices, the scent of crawfish and spices sharp in his nose. A woman's laughter, low and rich, cuts through the din, but it dies as she sees him, her hand tracing a sign in the air. Van Helsing's crucifix feels heavy in his satchel, a shield he may need sooner than he thinks. The church looms ahead, its steeple stark against the reddening sky, its walls weathered, stained with river damp. Father Antoine waits at the door, his cassock frayed, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow with sleepless nights. "Professor," he says, his voice trembling, his hands clasping Van Helsing's, rough and cold despite the heat. "You've come. God help us, you've come." Van Helsing nods, his mind racing, the boy's gris-gris a question, the city's fear an answer, The hunt has begun and the night is young, and Father Antoine's hands trembled as he clasped Van Helsing's, his grip surprisingly strong despite the frailty etched into his gaunt face. The church's heavy oak door groaned shut behind them, muffling the distant clamour of New Orleans streets, the clatter of carts, the shouts of vendors, the low wail of a steamboat on the Mississippi. Inside, the air was cooler but heavy, thick with the scent of beeswax from flickering candles and the faint must of old hymnals stacked in the pews. The stained glass windows depicting saints with solemn eyes glowed faintly in the last light of dusk, casting fractured colours across the stone floor, reds like blood, blues like bruises. Van Helsing's boots echoed as he followed the priest down the aisle, his satchel a reassuring weight against his hip, its contents clinking softly. Vials of holy water, a silver crucifix, a worn journal filled with notes on creatures that defied God's order. The church was a sanctuary, but not a safe one. The air tasted of dust and incense coating Van Helsing's throat, and he noted the scratches on the pews, deep, jagged, not the work of vandals, but something stronger, wilder. Father Antoine paused at the altar, his cassock brushing the floor, stirring motes of dust that danced in the candlelight. "You've seen much, Professor," he said, his voice low, cracked with exhaustion. "But this is different." His eyes, shadowed by sleepless nights, darted to the shadows pooling in the church's corners, as if expecting them to move. Van Helsing set his satchel on a pew, his fingers brushing the leather, grounding himself. The heat of the city still clung to his skin, his coat damp with sweat, but the priest's fear was colder, sharper, a blade against his senses. "Tell me everything," Van Helsing said, his Dutch accent thick, his tones steady but firm. He leaned against the pew, his grey eyes scanning the priest's face, noting the lines carved by dread, the way his hands twisted together, knuckles white. Father Antoine nodded, sinking onto a bench, his shoulders sagging as if unburdening himself might break him. "It began 6 months ago, he started," his voice barely above a whisper. "People vanishing, first from the swamps, then closer, from the quarter's edges. Fishers, washerwomen, even children. No bodies, at first. Just gone." He swallowed, his throat bobbing, and Van Helsing smelled the faint tang of fear sweat mingling with the church's wax and stone. The priest's story unfolded like a wound reopening. The disappearances were random, he said, but whispers linked them to the bayou, where cypress trees stood like silent watchers, their roots drowning in black water. Locals spoke of a cult hidden deep in the swamps, worshipping the loup-garou werewolves, creatures of hunger and rage. "They leave signs," Antoine said, his voice trembling. He reached into his cassock, pulling out a scrap of cloth, stained and torn, its edges frayed like something had clawed it free. Van Helsing took it, his fingers brushing the rough weave, noting the dark smears, blood-dried but unmistakable, its iron scent sharp in his nose. "Found near the last victim," Antoine whispered. "Marie Laveau's granddaughter brought it to me. She knows things." Van Helsing's brow furrowed, the name stirring memories of tales he'd heard in London. Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen, whose rituals blurred the line between faith and power. Her granddaughter, then, was no ordinary ally. He folded the cloth, tucking it into his satchel, his mind racing. The scratches on the pews, the bloodied cloth, the priest's fear. They painted a picture, but incomplete, like a puzzle missing its heart. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice low, urgent. Antoine hesitated, his eyes flicking to the crucifix above the altar, its silver glinting in the candlelight. "She comes at night," he said, "to Congo Square. She won't enter the church, says the spirits don't like it." Van Helsing nodded, his thoughts shifting to the city beyond these walls. New Orleans was a labyrinth of faiths, where Catholic hymns clashed with voodoo drums, where crosses hung beside charms woven with bone and hair. The air outside was alive, he knew, humid, heavy with the reek of river mud, the sweet rot of jasmine, the smoke of cook fires burning crab and okra. The people lived on the edge, their hands blistered from hauling nets or scrubbing floors, their faces gaunt with hunger, their eyes wary of the dark. This wasn't the New Orleans of gilded ballrooms or Creole romance. This was a city of survival, where yellow fever stalked the alleys, where the river gave life and took it just as quick. The loup-garou was no myth here. It was a truth carved in blood and fear. He rose, his coat rustling, the cold of the church a brief respite from the city's heat. "Take me to her," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Antoine stood, his cassock whispering against the stone, his face pale but resolute. They moved toward the door, the candles guttering as if protesting their departure. Outside, the night had fallen, the sky a bruise of purple and black, the stars hidden by clouds that smelled of a rain. The streets were quieter now, but not silent. The hum of cicadas, the creak of shutters, the distant wail of a banjo, its notes sharp, mournful. Van Helsing's boots sank into the mud, the air slick against his skin, tasting of salt and decay. The boy who'd led him earlier was gone, but his gree-gree pouch lingered in Van Helsing's mind. A talisman, perhaps, or a warning. Congo Square was a half-hour's walk, through alleys where gaslights flickered, their glow swallowed by shadows that seemed to breathe. The quarter's buildings leaned close, their balconies sagging, dripping with ferns that brushed Van Helsing's hat. The air grew thicker, the scent of rum and tobacco mingling with the sour tang of vomit in the gutters. A woman's voice, low and rich, sang in French from an open window, her words a lament that curled through the night. Antoine walked faster, his breath ragged, his eyes darting to every rustle, every shadow. Van Helsing's hand rested on his satchel, the crucifix's weight a comfort, though he knew silver alone wouldn't stop what hunted these streets. The square was a clearing, its earth packed hard by countless feet, its edges ringed by oaks draped in Spanish moss that swayed like ghosts. Torches burned, their flames casting jagged shadows, their smoke sharp in the nose. A crowd had gathered, men in patched shirts, women in headscarves, their hands clutching beads or bottles, their faces a mix of hope and dread. Drums pulsed, slow and deep, vibrating through the ground, stirring Van Helsing's blood. At the centre stood a woman, her skin dark as the night, her dress a vivid red, its hem muddied from the earth. Her eyes, when they met his, were sharp, knowing like a blade slicing through fog. She was young, no older than 30, but her presence was ancient, heavy with power. "Professor," she said, her voice smooth, laced with a Creole drawl, cutting through the drums. "You're late." Antoine flinched, but Van Helsing stepped forward, his boots crunching on the earth, his coat heavy with humidity. The air tasted of smoke and sweat, the heat pressing against his chest, but he held her gaze, his own unflinching. "You're Marie's kin," he said, not a question. She smiled, her teeth white, her lips curling like a secret. "Call me Celeste," she said, her hand gesturing to the crowd who parted like water. "You seek the loup-garou, so do we." Celeste led them to a tent at the square's edge, its canvas stained, smelling of herbs and wax. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with the scent of sage and something sharper. Blood, perhaps, or its memory. A table held candles, their flames steady despite the breeze, and a map, its edges curled, marked with crosses in red ink. Van Helsing's eyes traced the lines, noting the swamp's sprawl, the river's curve, the places where the crosses clustered. "Here," Celeste said, her finger tapping a spot deep in the bayou. "They take them here." Her voice was low, steady, but her eyes held a flicker of anger, raw and human. She spoke of the cult, her words painting a picture of rituals under moonlight, of men and women who shed their skin for fur, their screams becoming howls. The missing, she said, were offerings, or recruits, twisted by some dark rite. Van Helsing listened, his mind cataloguing her words, his fingers brushing the cloth in his satchel, its bloodstains a silent corroboration. The air grew heavier, the candles flickering, their wax dripping like tears. Antoine prayed softly, his rosary clicking, but Celeste's eyes never left Van Helsing's, challenging him to doubt her. He didn't. He'd seen too much, vampires, wraiths, things that laughed at God, to dismiss her truth. The night deepened, the drums outside fading, replaced by the chirp of crickets and the low croak of frogs. Celeste handed him a charm, a small pouch, like the boys, its leather warm, smelling of earth and spice. For protection, she said, her voice soft but firm. The swamp's no place for your cross alone. Van Helsing took it, his fingers lingering, the weight grounding him. He thought of Dracula, the Count's smile a blade in the dark, and wondered if this cult was born of similar hunger. The thought steadied him, his purpose clear. He would hunt as he always had for the living, for the lost. They left the tent, the air cooler now, the rain scent sharp, promising a storm. The square was empty, the torches guttered, their smoke curling like spirits. Antoine clutched his rosary, his face pale, but Van Helsing felt alive, the chase begun. He tucked the charm into his coat, its warmth a contrast to the crucifix's cold. The city waited, its shadows deep, its secrets deeper. He would face them, one step at a time, under the watchful eyes of a moon that had seen too much. The streets of New Orleans swallowed Van Helsing, Father Antoine, and Celeste as they left Congo Square, the night's humidity a heavy cloak pressing against their skin. The air was thick with the promise of rain, its scent sharp with ozone, mingling with the city's ever-present reek of river mud and rotting fruit. Gaslights flickered along the narrow alleys, their glow barely piercing the dark, casting shadows that danced across crumbling plaster walls. Van Helsing's boots sank into the muck, each step a soft squelch, the mud clinging like a living thing. His coat, still damp from the day's heat, chafed at his shoulders, but the weight of the charm in his pocket, Celeste's gift, warm and smelling faintly of sage, grounded him. Father Antoine walked close, his rosary beads clicking softly, his breath uneven, while Celeste moved with a quiet grace, her red dress a vivid slash against the gloom, her eyes scanning the shadows as if they whispered back. They headed toward the French Quarter's heart, where the streets grew tighter, the buildings leaning close, their shutters warped by years of damp. The sounds of the city were a low hum, muffled laughter from a tavern, the creak of a cartwheel, the distant wail of a fiddle weaving through the night. The air tasted of smoke and sour wine, coating Van Helsing's throat, and he coughed, his hand tightening on his satchel. The crucifix inside was a cold counterpoint to the charm, its silver a familiar weight, though he wondered if it would hold against the loup-garou. Celeste's words echoed in his mind. The swamp's no place for your cross alone. And he felt the city's pulse, alive with secrets, pressing against his chest. Celeste led them to a narrow shop tucked between a bakery and a blacksmith's. Its sign faded, the words apothecary barely legible in the flickering light. The door creaked as she pushed it open, releasing a wave of scents. Dried herbs, camphor, something metallic like blood dried on iron. The shop was cramped, its shelves sagging under jars of powders and roots, their labels curling like old skin. Candles burned low, their wax pooling on a wooden counter stained with years of spills. A man stood behind it, his skin dark, his hair greying at the temples, his hands steady as he ground something in a mortar, the pestil's rhythm a soft thud against the silence. "Jean," Celeste said, her voice low, commanding. "He's here." Jean's eyes, sharp despite his age, met Van Helsing's, measuring him. His hands paused, the mortar still, the air thick with the scent of crushed anise and something earthier, like grave dirt. "The hunter," Jean said, his voice a deep rumble, laced with the same Creole cadence as Celeste's. "You come for the loup-garou?" It wasn't a question. Van Helsing nodded, his grey eyes steady, noting the man's calloused fingers, the scars crisscrossing his knuckles, marks of a life spent fighting or surviving. "I need tools," Van Helsing said, his Dutch accent thick, his tone clipped. "Silver, wolfsbane, whatever you have." Jean's lips twitched, not quite a smile, and he gestured to a curtained alcove at the shop's rear. "This way," he said, moving with a limp, his left leg dragging slightly, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Van Helsing followed, Antoine trailing, his rosary clicking faster now, his face pale as moonlight. Celeste stayed by the counter, her fingers tracing the map from the tent, her eyes distant, as if listening to voices only she could hear. The alcove was darker, the air heavier, smelling of rust and dried flowers. A table held blades, daggers, their edges gleaming silver, their hilts wrapped in leather worn smooth by use. Jars lined the walls filled with roots and leaves, their labels inked in a spidery hand. Aconitum, belladonna, verbena. Van Helsing's fingers brushed a dagger, its blade cold, its weight balanced for throwing. "Silver?" he asked, his voice low, testing. Jean nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Melted from Spanish coins, blessed by a priest and a priestess both." He tapped a jar, its contents a tangle of purple flowers, their scent sharp, bitter. Wolfsbane, burns their blood, slows their change. Van Helsing took the jar, his mind cataloguing its uses, his thoughts flicking to old texts, Paracelsus, Malleus Maleficarum, none of which spoke of werewolves with such precision. This city, he realised, held knowledge he'd never encountered, born of its people's struggle to survive. Antoine hovered, his hands trembling, his eyes darting to the blades, the jars, the shadows. "Is it enough?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Can you stop them?" Van Helsing didn't answer, his focus on Jean, who pulled a small box from beneath the table, its wood carved with symbols, circles, crosses, not unlike those in Celeste's tent. Inside were bullets, their silver tips glinting, their weight heavy in Van Helsing's palm. "For a pistol," Jean said, his voice flat. "Aim for the heart." Van Helsing nodded, slipping the bullets into his satchel, their coldness a promise against the heat clinging to his skin. They returned to the shop's main room, where Celeste waited, her map now spread across the counter, its red crosses stark against the yellowed paper. "The bayou's a maze," she said, her finger tracing a path through the swamp's twists, where the crosses clustered like wounds. "You'll need a guide." Her eyes met Van Helsing's challenging, but there was something else. Grief, perhaps, or resolve. "I'll take you," she said, her voice steady, though her hand tightened on the map, crumpling its edge. Van Helsing studied her, noting the lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders held a weight beyond her years. She was no stranger to loss, he thought, her strength forged in the city's crucible of survival. They stepped back into the night, the shop's door creaking shut, the air a slap of humidity and rain scent. The streets were emptier now, the gaslights dimmer, their flames guttering in the rising wind. A dog barked, its cry sharp, answered by another, closer, hungrier. Van Helsing's hand rested on his satchel, the silver bullets a new weight, the wolfsbane jar a faint warmth. Antoine clutched his rosary, his lips moving silently, his cassock damp with sweat. Celeste led, her dress a beacon in the dark, her step sure despite the mud sucking at her boots. The city felt alive, its pulse a warning, its shadows shifting as if watching. They reached a boarding house near the river, its walls sagging, its windows boarded, the air thick with the stench of fish and tar. Inside, the common room was dim, lit by a single oil lamp, its flame casting shadows across tables scarred by years of use. A handful of men sat there, fishers, their hands rough from nets, their faces weathered by sun and fear. One, a broad man with a scar across his cheek, stood as Celeste entered, his eyes narrowing at Van Helsing. "This the hunter?" he asked, his voice low, his accent thick with Cajun tones. Celeste nodded, her hand gesturing to Van Helsing. "He's with us, Remy," she said, her tone brooking no argument. Remy studied Van Helsing, his gaze hard, his hands clenched, knuckles white with scars. "You ever seen a loup-garou?" he asked, his voice a challenge. Van Helsing met his eyes, his own unflinching. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm, though his mind conjured images of fangs and fur, of blood under moonlight. "But I've faced worse." Remy snorted, but there was respect in it, or at least acceptance. He gestured to the others, 3 men, their clothes patched, their faces gaunt, their eyes holding the same fear Van Helsing had seen in Antoine's. "We lost kin," Remy said, his voice softening. "My brother, 2 weeks gone. Found his boots in the swamp, nothing else." Van Helsing listened, his heart steady but heavy, the weight of their grief familiar. He thought of Amsterdam, of lives lost to shadows, of battles fought in the dark. "We'll find them," he said, his voice low, certain, though he knew the odds. The men nodded, their hands gripping knives or cups, their faces set with a fragile hope. Celeste spread the map on a table, its crosses glowing in the lamplight, and they gathered around, their breath stirring the air, thick with the scent of tobacco and sweat. The plan was simple. Enter the bayou at dawn, follow the crosses, find the cult's lair. Simple, but not easy. The swamp was a living thing, its waters black, its cypress knees sharp as blades, its air alive with the hum of things that hunted. They spent the night preparing, Van Helsing checking his pistol, its barrel cold, the silver bullets heavy in his palm. Celeste crushed wolfsbane, her fingers staining purple, the scent sharp, burning his nose. Antoine prayed, his voice a soft murmur, his rosary beads clicking like a heartbeat. The fishers sharpened knives, their blades scraping against whetstones, the sound a rhythm against the night's quiet. The boarding house creaked, its walls thin, letting in the city's sounds. Rain now falling, soft at first, pattering on the roof, the air tasting of wet earth and iron. Van Helsing sat by a window, its glass cracked, watching the rain streak through the dark, his mind on the swamp, on the cult, on the howls that haunted his dreams. As dawn approached, the rain slowed, leaving the air cooler, cleaner, though the city's stench lingered. Mud, fish, decay. They gathered their gear, knives, pistols, jars of herbs, a lantern for each, their wicks trimmed, their oil sharp in the nose. Celeste folded the map, her hands steady, her eyes meeting Van Helsing's with a silent promise. They would face this together. The fishers stood, their faces set, their fear buried under resolve. Antoine tucked his rosary into his cassock, his lips still moving, his faith a shield. Van Helsing shouldered his satchel, the charm and crucifix side by side, their weight a balance of old worlds and new. They stepped into the street, the dawn light grey, the city stirring, carts rumbling, voices calling, the river's hum a constant pulse. The swamp waited, its shadows deep, its secrets deeper. Van Helsing felt the city's eyes on him, human or not, but he walked on, his boots steady, his purpose clear. The hunt was no longer a question, it was a path, and he would follow it, step by step, into the heart of the bayou's darkness. The dawn light was a thin grey veil over New Orleans, as Van Helsing, Celeste, Father Antoine, and the fishers, Remy, with his scarred cheek, and 3 others, their faces hardened by loss, stepped from the boarding house into the street. The city stirred, its air sharp with the scent of wet earth from the night's rain, mingled with the ever-present tang of river mud and fish left too long in the market. The cobblestones glistened, slick under Van Helsing's boots, each step a soft crunch against the grit. His satchel hung heavy, the silver bullets and wolfsbane jar shifting inside, their weight a quiet promise against the morning's hush. Celeste led, her red dress dulled by the dim light, her map folded but vivid in her mind. her steps sure despite the mud clinging to her hem. Antoine clutched his rosary, his cassock damp, his breath shallow, while the fishers carried knives and lanterns, their oil wicks burning low, casting frail glows that flickered in the breeze. The Mississippi's hum was a constant pulse as they moved toward the city's edge, where the streets gave way to a wooden dock, its planks warped, smelling of tar and brine. A flatboat waited, its hull weathered, its oars resting like bones in the still water. Remy climbed aboard, his hands rough from years of nets, steadying the boat as the others followed. Van Helsing stepped carefully, the deck creaking under his weight, the air tasting of salt and decay, coating his throat. The river lapped at the boat, its surface black, reflecting the grey sky like a cracked mirror. Celeste sat at the bow, her eyes scanning the far bank where cypress trees loomed, their branches draped in Spanish moss, swaying like ghosts in the morning mist. Remy and another fisher, a lean man named Luke, took the oars, their strokes rhythmic, the wood groaning against the current. The boat glided into the bayou, the city's sounds fading, the clatter of carts, the shouts of dock workers, replaced by the swamp's own voice, the hum of cicadas, the croak of frogs, the splash of something unseen slipping into the water. The air grew heavier, wetter, pressing against Van Helsing's skin, his coat a burden now, its wool sodden with humidity. The scent was overwhelming. Rotting wood, stagnant water, the sharp bite of algae blooming in the heat. He gripped his pistol, its barrel cold, the silver bullets await in his pocket, his eyes tracing the shoreline where roots twisted like claws, half submerged, glistening with slime. Celeste's voice broke the silence, low and steady, her Creole accent curling through the mist. "Keep to the channels," she said, her finger pointing to a narrow path where the water was clearer, its surface rippling with the boat's wake. "Stray, and the swamp'll take you." Remy nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking to the trees where shadows moved, or seemed to. Van Helsing watched him, noting the scar on his cheek, the way his hands gripped the oar, knuckles white, not just from effort but from fear. These men knew the bayou, its fish and its currents. But this hunt was different. Its prey a shadow that wore their kin's faces. The swamp closed in, its cypress knees rising like tombstones, their bark rough, slick with moss that smelled of decay. The air was alive, buzzing with mosquitoes that stung Van Helsing's neck, their bites sharp, drawing blood he swatted away. The water was black, its depths hiding things he didn't want to imagine. Gators, perhaps, or worse. A bird screamed, its cry slicing through the hum, and Antoine flinched, his rosary beads slipping, catching on his sleeve. "Steady, father," Van Helsing said, his voice low, his Dutch accent thick, his hand resting on the priest's shoulder, firm but kind. Antoine nodded, his face pale, his lips moving in silent prayer, the beads clicking again, a frail rhythm against the swamp's pulse. They followed Celeste's map in their minds, the red crosses burned into memory, marking places where the missing had vanished, where the cult was said to hide. The first cross was near, Celeste had said, a clearing where the water widened, where the trees parted like a wound. Van Helsing's eyes scanned the banks, catching glints of movement. A snake, its scales gleaming, slithering into the water. A heron, its wings beating, lifting into the mist. The air tasted bitter, the swamp's breath coating his tongue, and he thought of Amsterdam's canals, their clean chill a world away. This place was primal, its hunger older than the city's crosses or Celeste's charms, a hunger that matched the Loup-Garou zone. A shape loomed ahead, a fallen cypress, its trunk half sunk, its roots clawing at the sky, draped in moss like tattered shrouds. Celeste raised a hand and Remy slowed the oars, the boat drifting toward the bank, its hull scraping against mud. "Here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes fixed on the clearing beyond where the trees opened, their branches twisted bare despite the season. Van Helsing stood, his boots steady on the deck, his pistol drawn, its weight familiar, the silver bullets a cold comfort. The air was colder here, despite the heat, smelling of earth and something sharper. Blood, faint but unmistakable, curling in his nose like a warning. They stepped ashore, the mud sucking at their boots, the ground soft, treacherous, smelling of rot and worms. The clearing was silent, the cicadas hushed, the air thick with a stillness that pressed against Van Helsing's chest. He moved forward, his eyes scanning the earth, noting the signs, broken reeds, scuffed dirt, a scrap of cloth caught on a root, its weave rough, stained dark. He knelt, his fingers brushing the cloth, its bloodstains dry, flaking under his touch, the scent faint but iron-sharp. "Another," he said, his voice low, passing the cloth to Celeste, who nodded, her face grim, her hand tightening on her own knife, its blade glinting in the dawn light. Remy cursed softly, his eyes on the trees, where the moss swayed, though no breeze stirred. "This is where we found my brother's boots," he said, his voice rough, his scar stark against his flushed skin. The other fishers, Luke, Henri and Paul, spread out, their knives drawn, their lanterns raised, the light frail against the mist. Antoine stayed close, his rosary clicking, his breath ragged, his eyes wide, seeing things Van Helsing couldn't, or wouldn't. The clearing felt wrong, its silence a weight, its shadows too deep, pooling like ink under the trees. Van Helsing's hand brushed the wolfsbane jar, its warmth a contrast to the pistol's cold, his mind racing. Dracula's castle had felt like this, alive, watching, hungry. A mark caught his eye, carved into a cypress trunk, its bark peeled back, the wood raw, glistening. A circle, crossed with claws, not unlike the symbols on Jean's box, but cruder, angrier. Celeste knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the cuts, her face unreadable. "Their sign," she said, her voice low, her eyes meeting Van Helsing's, holding a warning. "They know we're here." The words settled like stones, heavy, cold, and Van Helsing felt the swamp's eyes, human perhaps or not, watching from the dark. He stood, his pistol steady, his heart calm, trained by years of hunting shadows. "Then we move on," he said, his voice firm, his gaze sweeping the group, steadying them. They returned to the boat, the mud reluctant to release their boots, the air thicker now, the blood scent lingering, teasing Van Helsing's senses. Remy took the oars again, his strokes harder, his jaw set, his scar a silent vow. The boat glided deeper, the swamp's channels narrowing, the cypress knees closer, their roots scraping the hull, the sound a low groan against the water's lap. The mist thickened, curling like smoke, muffling the world, and Van Helsing thought of the cult, their rituals under moonlight, their howls a chorus of hunger. The charm in his pocket was warm, the crucifix cold, their balance a tether to his purpose. The next cross was hours away, Celeste said, deeper where the swamp grew wilder, where the water was blacker, the trees older. They rode in silence, the swamp sounds their only company. The splash of fish, the cry of a hawk, the rustle of leaves that might be wind or something else. Van Helsing watched the water, its surface rippling, hiding its depths, his mind on the cult, on Remy's brother, on the bloodied cloth. The air tasted of algae and fear, sharp on his tongue, and he wondered if the loup-garou were men turned beast or something older, born of the swamp's heart. The thought didn't scare him. It focused him, his hunter's instinct alive, his faith, though battered, holding. The boat rounded a bend, the channel widening, the trees parting to reveal a stretch of water glinting in the rising sun, its light harsh, revealing the swamp's scars, fallen logs, tangled roots, bones half buried in mud, too small to be human, or so Van Helsing hoped. Celeste pointed ahead, her hand steady, her eyes fixed on a distant bank where the next cross waited, its mark a promise of answers or danger. They rode on, the boat steady, the swamp silent, its secrets buried, but not gone. Van Helsing gripped his pistol, his eyes on the horizon, his purpose alight in the dark, guiding him deeper into the bayou's embrace. The bayou's black water rippled under the flatboat's hull, its surface catching the sun's harsh glare as Van Helsing, Celeste, Father Antoine and the fishers, Remy, Luc, Henri and Paul, rowed toward the next cross marked on Celeste's map. The swamp was a living maze, its cypress trees looming like ancient sentinels, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed in the humid breeze, brushing the air with a faint musty scent. Van Helsing gripped his pistol, its silver bullets cold in his pocket, the wolfsbane jar a faint warmth against his thigh. His boots caked with mud from the last clearing pressed against the boat's deck, the wood creaking under his weight, the air thick with the stench of algae, rotting wood, and a lingering trace of blood that prickled his nose. Celeste sat at the bow, her red dress vivid against the swamp's greens and greys, her eyes fixed on the distant bank, her knife glinting in her lap. Antoine's rosary clicked, his cassock damp with sweat, his face pale while the fishers rowed, their hands scarred, their breaths heavy, their eyes darting to the shadows pooling under the trees. The swamp's sounds were a relentless chorus, the hum of mosquitoes, their stings sharp on Van Helsing's neck. Drawing blood he swatted away, the splash of fish, their scales glinting before vanishing, the croak of frogs, their calls a low pulse against the water's lap. The air tasted bitter, coating his tongue with decay, the heat pressing like a fist, slicking his skin with sweat that stung his eyes. Remy's oarstrokes were steady, his scar stark against his flushed cheek, but his gaze was restless, scanning the banks where roots twisted like claws, half submerged, glistening with slime. Luc, Henri and Paul followed his rhythm, their lanterns swinging, their oil wicks burning low, casting frail glows that flickered in the mist. The clearing they'd left behind, its bloodied cloth, its clawed symbol, hung heavy in Van Helsing's mind, a warning that the Loup-Garou cult was close, watching. The channel narrowed, the cypress knees scraping the boat's hull, the sound a low groan that tightened Van Helsing's chest. Celeste raised a hand, her voice low, cutting through the swamp's hum. "Slow," she said, her Creole accent sharp, her eyes narrowing at a bend ahead, where the water widened, its surface still, too still, like a held breath. Remy eased the oars, the boat drifting, its wake rippling against the roots. Van Helsing stood, his boots steady, his pistol raised, its barrel cold against his palm. The air was colder here, despite the heat, smelling of earth and something sharper. Fresh blood, not the faint trace from before, but vivid, metallic, curling in his nose like a lure. His heart steadied, his hunter's instinct alive, honed by years of facing shadows in Amsterdam's alleys and Transylvania's forests. A shape moved on the bank, swift, low, gone in a blink. But Van Helsing's eyes caught it. A figure, human or not, slipping behind a cypress, its bark rough, stained with moss. He gestured, silent, and Celeste nodded, her knife ready, her face grim. Remy and Luc drew their knives, their blades dull but sharp enough, their hands trembling, not from fear but from the weight of lost kin. Remy's brother, Luc's cousin, gone to the swamp's hunger. Antoine's rosary stopped, his breath hitching, his eyes wide, seeing nothing but feeling everything. The swamp's pulse, its eyes, its teeth. Henri and Paul raised their lanterns, the light slicing through the mist, revealing the bank, mud, roots, and a glint of something, metal, perhaps, or bone. Van Helsing stepped ashore, the mud sucking at his boots, the ground soft, treacherous, smelling of rot and worms. The others followed, their steps heavy, the air thick with tension pressing against their chests. The bank was a tangle of reeds and roots, their tips broken, scuffed as if something had passed through, fast and careless. Van Helsing knelt, his fingers brushing the earth, finding a print. Not a boot, but a paw, too large for a wolf, its claws deep, the mud still wet, glistening. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with clarity. The loup-garou was real, not a tale, but a truth carved in the swamp's flesh. He showed the print to Celeste, who nodded, her eyes dark, her hand tightening on her knife. "They're hunting," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her breath warm, smelling of sage. A rustle came from the trees, sharp, deliberate, and Van Helsing rose, his pistol aimed, his eyes scanning the shadows. Two figures emerged, swift, silent, their forms human but wrong, too tall, too lean, their movements fluid, like predators stalking prey. Their eyes glinted, yellow, not human, catching the lantern's light, their faces shadowed, their hands empty but clawed, the nails black, curved, the air around them smelled of blood and musk, heavy, sickening, twisting Van Helsing's stomach. "Oh, stay back," he said, his voice low, steady, his Dutch accent thick, his pistol unwavering. The fishers formed a line, their knives raised, their breaths ragged, their faces set with a mix of fear and rage. Antoine stepped back, his rosary slipping, his lips moving in prayer, the words lost in the swamp's hum. The figures paused, their heads tilting, their eyes locked on Van Helsing as if measuring him. One stepped forward, its cloak tattered, its face half hidden, revealing teeth too sharp, too long. "You come for us," it said, its voice a rasp, not human, vibrating through the air like a growl. Van Helsing's grip tightened, his finger on the trigger, the silver bullet ready. "I come for the missing," he said, his voice calm, his eyes unflinching. "Where are they?" The creature laughed, a sound like bones cracking, its companions circling, its claws scraping the mud, leaving marks that smelled of blood. Celeste moved, swift, her knife flashing, aimed at the second creature's chest. It dodged, its speed unnatural, its claws slashing, catching her sleeve, tearing the red fabric, the sound a sharp rip against the silence. Remy lunged, his knife aimed high, but the first creature swatted him, its strength brutal, sending him sprawling into the mud, his lantern shattering, its oil igniting, a brief flare that lit the clearing, revealing the creatures' faces, human once, now twisted, their jaws elongated, their eyes burning. Van Helsing fired, the pistol's crack splitting the air, the silver bullet striking the first creature's shoulder, its howl a scream of pain, raw, inhuman, echoing through the swamp. The second creature leapt, its claws aimed at Van Helsing, but Lucanan retackled it, their knives slashing, their breaths heavy, their faces grim. The creature thrashed, its strength overwhelming, its claws raking Luke's arm, blood welling, its scent sharp, mixing with the swamp's decay. Van Helsing reloaded, his hand steady, the silver bullet cold, his eyes on the first creature, which staggered, its shoulder smoking, the wound black, unnatural. Celeste threw her knife, its blade sinking into the creature's thigh, its howl louder, shaking the trees, the moss swaying like a curtain. The fishers fought, their knives flashing, their grunts mixing with the creature's growls, the mud churning under their boots, the air thick with blood and fear. The first creature fell, its body twitching, its eyes dimming, the silver burning through its flesh, the smell acrid, choking. The second broke free, its claws slashing, catching Paul's chest, his cry sharp, his blood soaking his shirt, the scent overwhelming. Van Helsing fired again, the bullet striking the creature's chest, its heart, its howl cut short, its body collapsing, the mud swallowing it, the air still, heavy. The fishers panted, their knives dripping, their faces pale, their eyes wide, seeing death up close, too close. Antoine knelt by Paul, his hands trembling, his prayer a whisper, his rosary pressed against the wound, useless but desperate. Van Helsing checked Luke's arm, the cuts deep, bleeding, the scent of blood sharp, dangerous in this place. Celeste tore her sleeve, binding the wound, her hands steady, her face grim, her eyes meeting Van Helsing's, a silent acknowledgement. They'd survived, but barely. Remy helped Paul, his hands shaking, his scar stark, his brother's boots a memory in the mud. The creatures' bodies lay still, their forms shifting. Not beast, but human now, their faces gaunt, their eyes empty, their claws gone, leaving only hands, scarred, human. Van Helsing knelt, his fingers brushing a necklace on one, a cross, twisted, clawed, like the symbol on the tree, its metal warm, smelling of blood. They dragged the bodies to the boat, the mud reluctant, the air thicker, the swamp watching, its silence a weight. Van Helsing's pistol was heavy, the silver bullets fewer, the wolfsbane jar untouched, its warmth a reminder. Celeste retrieved her knife, its blade stained, her breath steady, her charm a faint glow in her pocket. The fishers carried Paul, his face pale, his blood soaking the deck, his breath shallow. Antoine prayed, his voice stronger now, his faith battered but holding. They rowed on, the boat heavy, the water black, the next cross closer, its promise darker, deeper. Van Helsing watched the swamp, his eyes sharp, his heart steady, the hunt alive, its path a thread through the bayou's heart, leading them into the shadows where answers waited or death. The flatboat cut through the bayou's black water, its hull heavy with the weight of the cult scouts' bodies, their forms human now, sprawled across the deck, their blood seeping into the wood, its iron scent sharp against the swamp's reek of algae and rot. Van Helsing sat at the stern, his pistol resting on his knee, its barrel cold, the remaining silver bullets a dwindling weight in his pocket. His boots, crusted with mud, pressed against the deck, the boat's creak a low pulse under the swamp's hum, cicadas droning, frogs croaking, the splash of something unseen slipping into the water. Celeste guided the boat, her red dress stained with mud and torn at the sleeve, her knife sheathed but ready, her eyes scanning the cypress trees, their branches draped in Spanish moss, swaying like tattered veils in the humid breeze. Father Antoine knelt by Paul, his rosary clicking, his cassock soaked with sweat and river spray, his prayers a soft murmur over the fisher's shallow breaths, his chest wound, bound but bleeding, the cloth dark, smelling of copper. Remy rowed, his scar stark against his flushed cheek, his hands steady despite the tremor Van Helsing saw in his grip, the loss of his brother a shadow in his eyes. Luke, his arm bandaged, rode beside him, his face pale, the claw marks throbbing, their scent faint but bitter, mixing with the wolfsbane jar's sharp warmth in Van Helsing's satchel. Henry and Paul's lanterns swung, their oil wicks low, casting frail glows that flickered in the mist. The swamp's shadows pooling deeper as the sun climbed, its light harsh, revealing the bayou's scars, fallen logs, tangled roots, bones glinting in the mud, too small for human, or so Van Helsing told himself. The air was thick, pressing against his skin, slicking it with sweat that stung his eyes, the taste of decay coating his tongue, the heat a weight that made each breath a labour. The channel twisted, the cypress knees scraping the hull, their bark rough, glistening with slime, the sound a groan that tightened Van Helsing's chest. Celeste pointed ahead, her hand steady, her voice low, her Creole accent curling through the mist. "The next cross," she said, her eyes fixed on a bank where the trees parted, their branches bare, twisted like bones reaching for the sky. Van Helsing nodded, his fingers brushing the charm in his pocket, its leather warm, smelling of sage, a contrast to the crucifix's cold silver. The scout's necklace, clawed, twisted, burned in his mind, its symbol matching the tree from the last clearing, a mark of the Loup-Garou cult, their hunger a pulse in the swamp's heart. They reached the bank, the mud sucking at their boots as they stepped ashore, the ground soft, treacherous, smelling of rot and earthworms. Paul stayed on the boat, his face grey, his breaths ragged, Henri guarding him, his knife drawn, his eyes darting to the trees where the moss swayed, though no breeze stirred. Van Helsing led, his pistol ready, his steps deliberate, the air colder here, despite the heat, smelling of blood, fresh and vivid, curling in his nose like a warning. The clearing was larger, its earth packed hard, scuffed with prints, paws, boots, claws, churning the mud, the scent overwhelming, mixing with the swamp's decay. A circle of stones stood at the centre, blackened, stained, their surfaces slick with something dark. Blood, ash, or both, the smell acrid, choking. Celeste knelt by the stones, her fingers tracing a symbol carved into one, a circle, clawed like the necklace, its edges raw, the stone warm, unnatural. Their altar, she whispered, her voice steady but her eyes dark, holding a grief Van Helsing recognised, loss, carved deep by this place. He scanned the clearing, noting the signs, broken reeds, a scrap of cloth, its weave rough, bloodied like the one from before, a bone, human, its end gnawed, half buried in the mud, its marrow exposed, the scent sharp, sickening. His heart steadied, his hunter's instinct alive, cataloguing the scene. These were no mere hunters, but a cult. Their rituals are packed with something primal, older than the crosses or charms they mocked. Remy cursed, his voice low, his knife slashing at a reed, its sap oozing, smelling of bitter green. "This is where they took him," he said, his eyes on the bone, his scar twitching, his brother's boots a ghost in the mud. Luke clutched his wounded arm, his face pale, his eyes wide, seeing the bone, smelling the blood, fearing his cousin's fate. Antoine stepped forward, his rosary still, his face grim, his voice stronger now, tempered by the fight. "This is blasphemy," he said, his hand tracing a cross in the air, the gesture frail against the clearing's weight. Van Helsing touched his shoulder, his grip firm, grounding. "It's worse," he said, his Dutch accent thick, his eyes on the stones, their stains a map of sacrifice. A sound came from the trees, soft, deliberate, like silk dragging across bark or claws on wood, the air growing heavier, colder, pressing against their chests. Van Helsing raised his pistol, his eyes scanning the shadows, catching a glint, yellow, glowing, gone in a blink. Celeste stood, her knife drawn, her charm glowing faintly, its warmth a pulse in her hand. The fishers formed a circle, their knives ready, their breaths heavy, their faces set with a mix of fear and resolve. Antoine's prayer resumed, his voice low, the rosary clicking, a rhythm against the swamp silence. The sound came again, closer from the west, and Van Helsing turned, his pistol steady, his heart calm, trained by years of facing the dark. A figure stepped from the trees, human, or so it seemed. A woman, her dress tattered, once white, now stained with mud and blood, her hair wild black, a shroud over her face. Her eyes, when they lifted, were yellow, not human, burning through the mist, her hands clawed, trembling as if fighting their own hunger. The air around her smelled of blood and musk, heavy, twisting Van Helsing's stomach. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice a rasp, breaking, human yet not, vibrating through the clearing like a growl. Celeste stepped forward, her knife raised, her eyes locked on the woman's, her voice steady. "You're one of them," she said, not a question, her grief a blade in her words. The woman flinched, her claws twitching, her eyes flickering, yellow, then brown, human, pleading, then yellow again, a struggle Van Helsing saw, his mind racing. "Not by choice," she whispered, her voice cracking, her hands rising, not to strike but to shield, her nails black, curved, catching the light. "They take you, change you." She staggered, her knees sinking into the mud, the scent of her blood sharp, fresh, as if her body fought itself, tearing from within. Van Helsing lowered his pistol, his eyes on her face, seeing not a beast but a victim, her humanity a flicker in the dark. "Who leads them?" he asked, his voice low, urgent, his Dutch accent thick, his heart heavy. She shook her head, her hair falling, her breath ragged, smelling of fear and decay. "The one who howls," she said, her voice breaking, her eyes yellow, burning, then brown. Human, tears streaking her face, their salt sharp in the air. He sees all?" She collapsed, her body trembling, the mud swallowing her knees, the scent of her blood overwhelming, mixing with the altar's stains. Celeste knelt, her knife lowered, her hand reaching, hesitant, her charm glowing, its warmth a contrast to the clearing's cold. "We can help you," she said, her voice soft, her eyes holding the woman's, human to human, despite the claws, the eyes, the hunger. The woman laughed, a sound like glass shattering, raw, desperate, her claws slashing the air, not at Celeste but at herself, tearing her sleeve, her skin, blood welling, its scent sharp, drowning the swamp's reek. "No help," she gasped, her eyes yellow, fixed, her body twitching, as if the beast within surged, drowning her. Van Helsing stepped closer, his pistol raised, not to fire but to steady, his heart torn. Hunter, healer, both at war. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice calm, his eyes on hers, seeing the flicker of humanity fading fast. She pointed west, her claw trembling, the trees swallowing her gesture, the shadows deeper, alive. A howl rose, distant, low, vibrating through the swamp, shaking the moss, silencing the cicadas, the frogs, the air itself. The woman screamed, her voice human, then beast, her body convulsing, her claws lengthening, her face twisting, fur sprouting, patchy, wrong. Van Helsing fired, the silver bullet striking her heart, her howl cut short, her body collapsing, human again, her eyes brown, empty, her blood soaking the mud, the scent overwhelming, final. The fishers stepped back, their knives trembling, their faces pale, their breaths heavy. Antoine's prayer faltered, his rosary slipping, his face grim, his faith battered. Celeste stood, her knife sheathed, her charm dim, her eyes wet, her grief a weight Van Helsing felt, shared. They carried her body to the boat, the mud reluctant, the air thicker, the swamp's eyes watching, its silence heavier. Van Helsing's pistol was lighter, the silver bullets fewer, the wolfsbane jar untouched, its warmth a fading hope. Remy rode, his hand steady, his scar a vow, his brother's ghost closer now. Luke bound his arm tighter, his face pale, his eyes on the woman, seeing his cousin, fearing the same. Paul breathed, faint, his wound bound, his life a thread. They rode west, the howls echo a guide, the swamp's heart closer, its secrets buried but stirring, waiting for them in the shadows where the cult's altar burned, a flame in the dark. The bayou's black water swallowed the flatboat's wake, its surface rippling under the weight of the group's silence as they rode west, the distant howl still echoing in their ears. Van Helsing gripped his pistol, its barrel cold, the silver bullets lighter in his pocket, each shot a step closer to the Loup-Garou cult's heart. His boots, crusted with mud and blood, pressed against the deck, the wood slick with river spray, its creak a faint pulse under the swamp's relentless hum, cicadas droning, frogs croaking, the splash of unseen things slipping into the depths. Celeste sat at the bow, her red dress torn, stained with mud and the woman's blood, her knife sheathed but close, her eyes scanning the cypress trees, their branches heavy with Spanish moss, swaying like ghosts in the humid breeze. Father Antoine knelt by Paul, his rosary clicking, his cassock soaked, his prayers a whisper over the fishers' faint breaths, his chest wound seeping, the cloth dark, smelling of copper and decay. Remy rode, his scar stark, his hands steady but tight, the memory of his brother's boots, and now the woman's twisted face, a weight in his chest. Luke, his arm bandaged, rode beside him, his face grey, the claw marks burning, their scent bitter, mixing with the wolfsbane jar's sharp warmth in Van Helsing's satchel. Henry guarded the boat's rear, his knife drawn, his lantern low, its oil wick flickering, casting shadows that danced across the bodies of the cult scouts and the woman, their forms human but wrong, their blood staining the deck, its iron scent thick, choking. The air was heavy, pressing against Van Helsing's skin, slicking it with sweat that stung his eyes, the taste of algae and blood coating his tongue, the heat a fist that made each breath a struggle. The swamp tightened, its channels narrowing, the cypress knees scraping the hull, their bark rough, glistening with slime, the sound a groan that pricked Van Helsing's senses. The sun climbed, its light harsh, slicing through the mist, revealing the bayou scars, fallen logs, tangled roots, bones glinting in the mud, their shapes too human for comfort. The woman's words, the one who howls, he sees all, burned in Van Helsing's mind, her yellow eyes a ghost in his thoughts, her humanity a flicker snuffed out by a silver bullet. He touched the charm in his pocket, its leather warm, smelling of sage, a tether to Celeste's world, balanced against the crucifix's cold silver, his faith a shield battered but holding. Celeste pointed to a bank ahead, her hand steady, her voice low, her Creole accent cutting through the swamp's hum. "The next cross is close," she said, her eyes fixed on a clearing where the trees parted, their branches bare, twisted, like claws against the sky. Van Helsing nodded, his fingers brushing the clawed necklace from the scout, its metal warm, its symbol a match for the altar's stones, a mark of the cult's hunger. The boat drifted toward the bank, its hull scraping mud, the ground soft, treacherous, smelling of rotten earthworms. They stepped ashore, leaving Paul with Henri, his breaths weaker, his face grey, his blood soaking the deck, the scent sharp, dangerous in this place. Henry guarded the boat's rear, his knife drawn, his lantern low, its oil wick flickering, casting shadows that danced across the bodies of the cult scouts and the woman, their forms human but wrong, their blood staining the deck, its iron scent thick, choking. The air was heavy, pressing against Van Helsing's skin, slicking it with sweat that stung his eyes, the taste of algae and blood coating his tongue, the heat a fist that made each breath a struggle. The swamp tightened, its channels narrowing, the cypress knees scraping the hull, their bark rough, glistening with slime, the sound a groan that pricked Van Helsing's senses. The sun climbed, its light harsh, slicing through the mist, revealing the bayou's scars, fallen logs, tangled roots, bones glinting in the mud, their shapes too human for comfort. The woman's words, the one who howls, he sees all, burned in Van Helsing's mind, her yellow eyes a ghost in his thoughts, her humanity a flicker snuffed out by his silver bullet. He touched the charm in his pocket, its leather warm, smelling of sage, a tether to Celeste's world, balanced against the crucifix's cold silver, his faith a shield battered but holding. Celeste pointed to a bank ahead, her hand steady, her voice low, her Creole accent cutting through the swamp's hum. "The next cross is close," she said, her eyes fixed on a clearing where the trees parted, their branches bare, twisted like claws against the sky. Van Helsing nodded, his fingers brushing the clawed necklace from the scout, its metal warm, its symbol a match for the altar's stones, a mark of the cult's hunger. The boat drifted toward the bank, its hull scraping mud, the ground soft, treacherous, smelling of rot and earthworms. They stepped ashore, leaving Paul with Henri, his breaths weaker, his face grey, his blood soaking the deck, the scent sharp, dangerous in this place. The clearing was smaller, its earth churned, scuffed with prints, paws, boots, claws, smelling of blood and ash, the air colder, heavier, pressing against their chests. A circle of trees stood like sentinels, their trunks carved with symbols, circles, claws, crosses, raw, glistening, the bark peeled back, the wood warm, unnatural. Van Helsing knelt, his fingers tracing a print, too large for a wolf, its claws deep, the mud wet, fresh. His pulse quickened, his hunter's instinct alive, cataloguing the scene. Reeds broken, a scrap of cloth, blooded, its weave rough like the others. A knife, its blade rusted, half buried, its hilt carved with the same clawed circle. The scent of blood faint but vivid, curling in his nose. Remy's eyes darkened, his knife slashing at a reed, its sap oozing, smelling of bitter green. "They're close," he said, his voice rough, his scar twitching, his brother's ghost awaiting his words. Luke clutched his wounded arm, his face pale, his eyes wide, smelling the blood, fearing his cousin's fate. Antoine stepped forward, his rosary still, his face grim, his voice steady now, tempered by the woman's death. "This is their ground," he said, his hand tracing a cross in the air, the gesture frail against the clearing's pulse. Van Helsing stood, his pistol ready, his eyes scanning the trees, catching a glint, yellow, glowing, gone in a blink. A rustle came from the west, sharp, deliberate, like claws on bark, the air growing colder, thicker, pressing against their lungs. Van Helsing raised his pistol, his heart calm, his eyes locked on the shadows where the moss swayed, though no breeze stirred. Celeste drew her knife, her charm glowing faintly, its warmth a pulse in her hand. Remy and Luke formed a line, their knives raised, their breaths heavy, their faces set with resolve. Antoine's prayer resumed, his rosary clicking, a rhythm against the swamp silence. The rustle came again, closer, and Van Helsing turned, his pistol steady, his mind racing. Dracula's castle had felt like this, alive, watching, hungry. Luke moved first, his knife slashing at the air, his wounded arm trembling, his face twisted, not with fear but with rage, his eyes yellow, glinting, wrong. Van Helsing froze, his pistol wavering, his heart lurching as Luke turned, his claws lengthening, his face shifting, fur sprouting, patchy, his jaw elongating, his teeth sharp, too long. The air around him smelled of blood and musk, heavy, sickening, twisting Van Helsing's stomach. "Luke," Remy shouted, his knife dropping, his scar stark, his eyes wide, seeing his cousin, then a beast, the betrayal a blade in his chest. Celeste stepped back, her knife raised, her eyes dark, her voice low, urgent. "He's gone," she said, her grief a weight, her charm dim, her hand steady. Luke lunged, his claws aimed at Van Helsing, his howl a scream, raw, inhuman, shaking the trees, the moss swaying like a curtain. Van Helsing dodged, his boots slipping in the mud, the air thick, choking, the scent of blood overwhelming. Remy tackled Luke, his strength desperate, his knife slashing, catching Luke's arm, blood welling, its scent sharp, mixing with the swamp's decay. Luke thrashed, his claws raking Remy's shoulder, the wound deep, bleeding, the scent vivid, dangerous. Van Helsing fired, the silver bullet striking Luke's thigh, his howl louder, shaking the clearing, the wound smoking, black, unnatural. Antoine prayed, his voice breaking, his rosary slipping, his face pale, his faith a flicker in the dark. Celeste threw her knife, its blade sinking into Luke's back, his howl cut short, his body staggering, his eyes yellow, then brown, human, pleading, then yellow again, a struggle Van Helsing saw, his heart torn, hunter, healer, both at war. "I didn't know," Luke gasped, his voice human, breaking, his claws twitching, his body sinking into the mud, the scent of his blood sharp, drowning the swamp's reek. They changed me! He collapsed, his body twitching, human now, his face gaunt, his eyes empty, his blood soaking the mud, the scent final. Remy knelt, his hands trembling, his shoulder bleeding, his scar a vow, his cousin's death a weight he'd carry forever. Van Helsing checked Remy's wound, the cuts deep, bleeding, the scent dangerous, the swamp's eyes watching, its silence heavier. Celeste tore her dress, binding the wound, her hands steady, her face grim, her eyes meeting Van Helsing's, a silent question. How many more? Antoine retrieved the rosary, his hand shaking, his prayer resuming, his voice stronger, his faith battered but holding. They dragged Luke's body to the boat, the mud reluctant, the air thicker, the swamp's pulse a warning. Paul's breaths were fainter, his face grey, his wound seeping, his life a thread. Henri stood, his knife trembling, his eyes wide, seeing Luke, fearing Paul, fearing himself. They rowed on, the boat heavier, the water blacker, the cypress knees closer, their roots scraping the hull, the sound a low groan against the swamp's hum. Van Helsing's pistol was lighter, the silver bullets fewer, the wolfsbane jar untouched, its warmth a fading hope. Celeste guided, her eyes west, her map a memory, the crosses closer, their marks a path to the cult's heart. Remy rode, his shoulder bound, his face pale, his scar a silent vow, his brother and cousin ghosts in the mist. The swamp watched, its shadows deeper, its secrets stirring, waiting for them in the clearing where the howls grew louder, a chorus in the dark. They reached a wider channel, the water glinting in the sun, its surface rippling, hiding its depths, the trees parting to reveal a bank where the next cross waited, its mark carved deeper, angrier, a promise of answers or betrayal. Van Helsing gripped his pistol, his eyes sharp, his heart steady, the hunt alive, its path a thread through the bayou shadows, leading them closer to the one who howled, whose eyes saw all, whose hunger burned like a flame in the swamp's heart. The flatboat glided through the bayou's black water, its hull heavy with the weight of loss. Luke's body sprawled beside the cult scouts and the woman, their blood seeping into the deck, its iron scent sharp against the swamp's reek of algae, rot, and damp earth. Van Helsing gripped his pistol, its barrel cold, the silver bullets dwindling in his pocket, each one a fragile shield against the Loop-Grew cult's hunger. His boots, crusted with mud and blood, pressed against the deck, the wood creaking under the strain, the air thick with humidity, slicking his skin with sweat that stung his eyes. Celeste sat at the bow, her red dress torn and stained, her knife sheathed but close, her eyes locked on the bank ahead, where the next cross waited, its mark carved deep, a promise of danger. Father Antoine knelt by Paul, his rosary clicking, his cassock soaked with river spray and sweat, his prayers a faint murmur over the fishers' weakening breaths, his chest wound seeping, the cloth dark, smelling of copper and decay. Remy rode, his shoulder bound, his scar stark against his pale face, his hands trembling but steady. The loss of his brother and cousin a weight that carved deeper with each stroke. Henri at the rear held his knife, his lantern low, its oil wick flickering, casting shadows across the bodies, their faces human but wrong, their eyes empty, their blood a stain that smelled of death. The swamp's hum was relentless. Cicadas droning, frogs croaking, the splash of unseen things slipping into the water, their ripples glinting in the sun's harsh light. The air tasted bitter, coating Van Helsing's tongue with algae and blood, the heat pressing like a vice, each breath a labour in the bayou's stifling embrace. The channel widened, the cypress knees receding, their roots scraping the hull less often, the sound a faint groan against the water's lap. The trees parted, revealing a bank where the mud was churned, scuffed with prints, paws, boots, claws, the scent of blood, vivid, fresh, curling in Van Helsing's nose like a lure. Celeste raised a hand, her voice low, her Creole accent sharp. "There," she said, pointing to a clearing where the trees stood like sentinels, their trunks carved with clawed circles, their bark peeled back, glistening, warm, unnatural. Van Helsing nodded, his fingers brushing the charm in his pocket, its leather warm, smelling of sage, a tether against the crucifix's cold silver, his faith a flame battered by the swamp's pulse. They stepped ashore, the mud sucking at their boots, the ground soft, treacherous, smelling of rot and worms. Henri stayed with Paul, his knife ready, his eyes darting to the trees where the moss swayed, though no breeze stirred. The clearing was vast, its earth packed hard, littered with bones, human, animal, gnawed, broken, their marrow exposed, the scent sickening mixing with ash and blood. A stone altar stood at the centre, larger than the last, its surface blackened, stained with dark pools, its edges carved with symbols, circles, claws, crosses, pulsing, alive. The air was colder, heavier, pressing against their chests, the smell overwhelming, choking, a blend of blood, ash and musk, primal, hungry. Van Helsing's heart steadied, his hunter's instinct alive, cataloguing the scene. Reeds broken, a tattered cloak, bloodied, its weave rough, a dagger, its blade silver, twisted, half buried, its hilt warm, smelling of blood. Remy's eyes darkened, his knife slashing at a reed, its sap oozing, bitter green. "This is their heart," he said, his voice rough, his scar twitching, his brother's ghost a shadow in the mud. Antoine's rosary stopped, his face grim, his voice steady now, tempered by loss. "This is evil," he said, his hand tracing a cross, the gesture frail against the altar's weight. Celeste knelt by the stones, her fingers tracing a symbol, her eyes dark, her grief a blade, her people, her city, bleeding in this place. A howl rose, close, shattering the swamp's hum, shaking the trees, the moss swaying like a curtain, the air colder, thicker, pressing against their lungs. Van Helsing raised his pistol, his eyes scanning the shadows, catching glints, yellow, glowing, circling, not one but many, a pack. Figures emerged, 6, their forms human but wrong, tall, lean, their movements fluid, predatory, their eyes burning, their claws long, black, curved. The air around them smelled of blood and musk, heavy, sickening, twisting Van Helsing's stomach. Their cloaks were tattered, stained, their faces shifting, jaws elongating, fur sprouting, patchy, their teeth sharp, too long, their howls a chorus that shook the clearing, the swamp, the sky. "Stay together," Van Helsing said, his voice low, steady, his Dutch accent thick, his pistol aimed at the nearest, its eyes locked on him, measuring. Celeste drew her knife, her charm glowing, its warmth a pulse in her hand, her eyes fierce, her grief fuel. Remy and Antoine formed a line, their knives raised, their breaths heavy, their faces set with resolve, fear buried under rage. The figures circled, their claws scraping the mud, their howls low, vibrating, a challenge. The leader, a man, or once a man, his cloak black, his eyes yellow burning, stepped forward, his jaw twitching, fur spreading, his body growing, taller, broader, his claws lengthening, his howl a roar that silenced the swamp. Van Helsing fired, the silver bullet striking the leader's chest, its howl cut short, its body staggering, the wound smoking, black, unnatural. The others lunged, their speed blinding, their claws slashing, the air thick with blood and musk, the scent overwhelming, choking. Celeste's knife flashed, catching one's arm, blood welling, its howl roar shaking the trees. Remy tackled another, his knife slashing, his shoulder wound reopening, blood soaking his shirt, the scent sharp, dangerous. Antoine swung his rosary, its silver cross striking a creature's face, the burn sizzling, its scream inhuman, echoing through the clearing. The fight was chaos, the mud churning, the air thick with blood, ash and musk, the swamp's pulse a drumbeat of hunger. Van Helsing reloaded, his hand steady, the silver bullet cold, his eyes on the leader who rose, its wound healing, the flesh knitting unnatural, its eyes burning, its howl a promise of death. Celeste threw her charm, its sage scent bursting, the creature flinching, its claws slashing, catching her arm, blood welling, the scent vivid, mixing with the altar's stains. Remy fought, his knife sinking into a creature's side, its howl shaking him, his face pale, his scar a vow, his brother's ghost a fire in his blood. Van Helsing fired again, the bullet striking the leader's heart, its howl louder, final, its body collapsing, fur receding, its face human, gaunt, its eyes empty, a man again, his blood soaking the mud, the scent final. The others faltered, their howls weakening, their forms shifting, fur fading, claws shrinking, their eyes yellow, then brown, human pleading. One fled, its steps heavy, the mud sucking, the swamp swallowing its retreat. The others fell, their bodies twitching, human now, their cloaks tattered, their faces scarred, their blood pooling, the scent overwhelming, choking. Van Helsing panted, his pistol lighter, the silver bullets nearly gone, the wolfsbane jar untouched its warmth, a fading hope. Celeste bound her arm, her face grim, her eyes wet, her grief a weight shared with the mud. Remy knelt, his shoulder bleeding, his knife dripping, his face pale, his scar a silent vow. Antoine prayed, his rosary clicking, his voice stronger, his faith battered but holding. They dragged the bodies to the altar, the mud reluctant, the air thicker, the swamp's eyes watching, its silence heavier. Henri called from the boat, his voice sharp, urgent. Paul's breaths were fainter, his life a thread, his wound seeping, the scent dangerous. They returned to the boat, the deck heavier, the water blacker, the cypress knees closer, their roots scraping the hull, the sound a groan against the swamp's hum. Celeste guided, her eyes west, her map a memory, the crosses fewer, their marks a path to the cult's leader, the one who howled, whose eyes saw all. Remy rode, his shoulder bound, his face pale, his scar a vow, his ghost closer. Van Helsing checked his pistol, its barrel cold, the silver bullets a final shield, his heart steady, his hunter's instinct alive. The swamp watched, its shadows deeper, its secret stirring, waiting for them in the clearing where the leader's howl burned, a flame in the dark. They reached a narrower channel, the water glinting, its surface rippling, hiding its depths, the trees parting to reveal a bank where the final cross waited, its mark carved deep, angry, a promise of answers, or death. Van Helsing gripped his pistol, his eyes sharp, his heart calm, the hunt alive, its path a thread through the bayou's heart, leading them to the one who ruled the shadows, whose hunger fed the swamp's soul. The bayou's black water churned under the flatboat's hull, its surface glinting in the sun's harsh light as Van Helsing, Celeste, Father Antoine, Remy and Henri rowed toward the final cross, the cult leader's lair a shadow in their minds. The deck was heavy with the bodies of the fallen cult scouts, the transformed woman Luke, their blood seeping into the wood, its iron scent sharp, mingling with the swamp's reek of algae, rot and damp earth. Van Helsing gripped his pistol, its barrel cold, the last silver bullets a faint weight in his pocket, the wolfsbane jar warm but untouched, its scent of sage a fading hope. His boots, crusted with mud and blood, pressed against the deck, the creak a low pulse under the swamp's hum, cicadas droning, frogs croaking, the splash of unseen things slipping into the depths. Celeste sat at the bow, her red dress torn, stained with blood and mud, her knife sheathed but close, her eyes locked on the bank ahead, where the cross waited, its mark carved deep, angry, a promise of reckoning. Remy rode, his shoulder wound bound but seeping, his scar stark against his pale face, his hands trembling, the loss of his brother and cousin a weight that carved deeper with each stroke. Henri guarded Paul, his knife ready, his lantern low. its oil wick flickering, casting shadows across the bodies, their faces human but wrong, their eyes empty, their blood a stain that smelled of death. Father Antoine knelt by Paul, his rosary clicking, his cassock soaked with sweat and river spray, his prayers a whisper over the fisher's faint breaths, his chest wound dark, seeping, the scent of copper and decay heavy in the air. The swamp's air was thicker, pressing against their skin, slicking it with sweat that stung their eyes, the taste of algae and blood coating their tongues, each breath a labour in the bayou's stifling grip. The channel narrowed, the cypress knees scraping the hull, their bark rough, glistening with slime, the sound a groan that tightened Van Helsing's chest. The trees parted, revealing a bank where the mud was churned, scuffed with prints. Paws, boots, claws, the scent of blood vivid, fresh, curling in his nose like a lure. Celeste raised a hand, her voice low, her Creole accent sharp. "This is it," she said, her eyes fixed on a clearing where the trees stood like a cathedral, their trunks carved with clawed circles, their bark peeled back, warm, unnatural. Van Helsing nodded, his fingers brushing the charm in his pocket, its leather warm, smelling of sage, a tether against the crucifix's cold silver, his faith aflame battered by the swamp's pulse. They stepped ashore, the mud sucking at their boots, the ground soft, treacherous, smelling of rot and worms. Henri stayed with Paul, his face grey, his breaths weaker, his life a thread, the scent of his blood dangerous in this place. The clearing was vast, its earth packed hard, littered with bones, human, animal, gnawed, broken, their marrow exposed, the scent sickening, mixing with ash and blood. A stone altar loomed, larger than the others, its surface blackened, stained with dark pools, its edges carved with symbols, circles, claws, crosses, pulsing, alive. The air was colder, heavier, pressing against their chests, the smell overwhelming, choking, a blend of blood, ash and musk, primal, hungry. A figure stood by the altar, tall, cloaked in black, his presence a weight, his eyes yellow, burning through the mist, his face human but wrong, jaws sharp, teeth long, fur patchy along his neck. The air around him smelled of blood and musk, heavier, sicker, twisting Van Helsing's stomach. His hands were clawed, black, curved, holding a staff carved with the same symbols, its wood warm, glistening, as if alive. "You've come," he said, his voice a growl, deep, vibrating through the clearing, shaking the trees, the moss swaying like a curtain. The hunter, the priest, the witch, the mourner. His eyes swept over them, Van Helsing, Antoine, Celeste, Remy, measuring, mocking, knowing. Van Helsing raised his pistol, its barrel steady, his heart calm, his hunter's instinct alive. "You lead them," he said, his Dutch accent thick, his eyes locked on the leaders, seeing not a man but a beast, its hunger a fire in its gaze. "The loup-garou. You take the living. Twist them." The leader smiled, his teeth glinting, his claws twitching, the air colder, thicker, pressing against their lungs. "Twist," he said, his voice silk over a blade. "I free them. This world, its hunger, its pain, binds you. I break those chains." He gestured to the altar, its stains a map of sacrifice, its scent overwhelming, choking. Celeste stepped forward, her knife drawn, her charm glowing, her eyes fierce, her grief a blade. "You took my kin," she said, her voice low, steady, her Creole accent sharp, her hand trembling, not with fear but rage. "You turned them, killed them." The leader's eyes narrowed, his smile fading, his claws lengthening, his fur spreading, his body growing, taller, broader, a full transformation, his howl a roar that shook the swamp, silencing the cicadas, the frogs, the air itself. Van Helsing fired, the silver bullet striking his shoulder, the wound smoking, black, unnatural, but the leader laughed, his flesh knitting, his eyes burning, his staff raised, its cymbals pulsing, alive. Remy lunged, his knife slashing, his shoulder wound reopening, blood welling, its scent sharp, dangerous. The leader swatted him, his claws raking Remy's chest, the cuts deep, bleeding, the scent vivid, mixing with the altar's stains. Antoine swung his rosary, its silver cross striking the leader's arm, the burn sizzling, his howl raw, shaking the trees. Celeste threw her knife, its blade sinking into the leader's thigh, his howl louder, his eyes yellow, burning, his body twitching, fighting the silver, the wolfsbane in the air, its scent sharp, bitter, a weapon Van Helsing hadn't used. The leader staggered, his transformation faltering, his face human, then beast, his eyes brown, then yellow, a struggle Van Helsing saw, his heart torn. Hunter, healer, both at war. Why? Van Helsing asked, his voice low, urgent, his pistol raised, the last bullet cold, final. Why this? The leader laughed, his voice breaking, his claws trembling, his eyes flickering, human, pleading, then yellow, hungry. To live, he said, his voice a rasp, his body sinking to the altar, the mud swallowing his knees, the scent of his blood sharp, overwhelming. This world kills, hunger, fever, pain. I give strength, eternity. Celeste knelt, her knife sheathed, her charm dim, her eyes wet, her grief a weight. You give death, she said, her voice soft, her hand reaching, not to strike but to understand, her fingers brushing the leader's cloak, its weave rough, stained with blood, ash and musk. Van Helsing lowered his pistol, his heart heavy, his mind racing. Dracula had spoken of eternity too, his eyes burning in the dark, his hunger a mirror to this man's. Was he a monster, or a man broken by the world's cruelty? The question gnawed, a moral wound deeper than the swamp's claws. Antoine prayed, his rosary clicking, his voice stronger, his faith battered but holding. You twist God's creation, he said, his hand tracing a cross, the gesture frail against the altar's pulse. The leader's eyes flickered, brown, human, his breath ragged, his blood soaking the mud, the scent final. Your God abandoned us, he gasped, his claws twitching, his body human now, gaunt, scarred, his eyes empty, his life fading. Van Helsing knelt, his fingers brushing the staff, its symbols warm, alive, a key to the cult's heart, its hunger. They stood, the clearing silent, the swamp watching, its shadows deeper, its secret stirring. Remy panted, his chest bleeding, his knife dripping, his face pale, his scar a vow, his ghost closer. Celeste retrieved her knife, her arm bound, her eyes wet, her grief a fire shared with the mud. Antoine's prayer resumed, his rosary a rhythm, his faith a shield. They dragged the leader's body to the altar, the mud reluctant, the air thicker, the swamp's eyes watching, its silence heavier. The boat waited, Paul's breaths fainter, Honori's face grim, the scent of blood dangerous, final. They rowed on, the water blacker, the cypress knees closer, their roots scraping the hull, the sound a groan against the swamp's hum. Van Helsing gripped his pistol, its last bullet await, his heart steady, his hunter's instinct alive. Celeste guided, her eyes west, her map a memory, the crosses gone, their path a thread to the cult's end. The swamp watched, its shadows deeper, its secrets buried but stirring, waiting for them in the silence where the howls had ceased, a quiet that promised peace, or a deeper dark. The flatboat cut through the bayou's black water, its hull heavier with the weight of the fallen. Cult scouts, the transformed woman, Luke, and now the cult leader, their blood seeping into the deck, its iron scent sharp, mingling with the swamp's reek of algae, rot, and damp earth. Van Helsing sat at the stern, his pistol empty, its barrel cold, the last silver bullet spent, the wolfsbane jar warm but untouched, its sage scent a faint hope against the crucifix's cold silver in his satchel. His boots, crusted with mud and blood, pressed against the deck, the wood creaking under the strain, the air thick with humidity, slicking his skin with sweat that stung his eyes. Celeste guided the boat, her red dress torn, stained with blood and mud, her knife sheathed, her eyes scanning the cypress trees, their branches draped in Spanish moss, swaying like ghosts in the humid breeze. Remy rode, his chest and shoulder wounds bound but seeping, his scar stark against his pale face, his hands trembling, the loss of his brother and cousin a weight that carved deeper with each stroke. Henri guarded Paul, his knife ready, his lantern low, its oil wick flickering, casting shadows across the bodies, their faces human but scarred, their eyes empty, their blood a stain that smelled of death. Father Antoine knelt by Paul, his rosary clicking, his cassock soaked with sweat and river spray, his prayers a whisper over the fisher's faint breaths, his chest wound dark, seeping, the scent of copper and decay heavy in the air. The swamp's hum was softer now, cicadas droning, frogs croaking, the splash of unseen things fainter, as if the bayou held its breath, sensing the cult's heart stilled. The channel widened, the cypress knees receding, their roots scraping the hull less often, the sound a faint groan against the water's lap. The sun climbed higher, its light harsh, slicing through the mist, revealing the swamp scars, fallen logs, tangled roots, bones glinting in the mud, their shapes too human for comfort. Van Helsing's mind turned, his hunter's instinct alive but weary, the leader's words, "I give strength, eternity," a shadow in his thoughts, echoing Dracula's promises, his hunger a mirror to this swamp's pulse. The charm in his pocket was warm, smelling of sage, a tether to Celeste's world, but the crucifix's cold silver weighed heavier, his faith battered by the moral wound of the leader's plea, his humanity a flicker in the dark. Celeste pointed to a bank ahead, her hand steady, her voice low, her Creole accent sharp. "One last place," she said, her eyes fixed on a clearing where the trees parted, their branches bare, twisted, like bones against the sky. Van Helsing nodded, his fingers brushing the carved star from the leader, its symbols warm, unnatural, a key to the cult's end. The boat drifted toward the bank, its hull scraping mud, the ground soft, treacherous, smelling of rot and worms. They stepped ashore, leaving Henri with Paul, his breaths weaker, his face grey, his blood seeping, the scent dangerous, final. The clearing was small, its earth churned, scuffed with prints, paws, boots, claws, the scent of blood faint but vivid, curling in Van Helsing's nose like a warning. A wooden structure stood at the centre, not an altar but a shrine, its beams weathered, stained with ash and blood, its roof sagging, draped with moss that smelled of decay. Symbols, circles, claws, crosses, carved its walls, their edges raw, glistening, warm, alive. Bones littered the ground, human, animal, gnawed, their marrow exposed, the scent sickening, mixing with ash and musk. A fire pit smouldered, its embers glowing, its smoke curling, sharp, choking, the air colder, heavier, pressing against their chests. Van Helsing's heart steadied, cataloguing the scene. Reeds broken, a tattered cloak, bloodied. A chain, its links rusted, coiled in the mud, its iron scent sharp, final. Remy's eyes darkened, his knife slashing at a reed, its sap oozing, bitter, green. "This is where they changed them," he said, his voice rough, his scar twitching, his brother's ghost a shadow in the mud. Antoine's rosary stopped, his face grim, his voice steady, tempered by loss. "This is their end," he said, his hand tracing across, the gesture frail against the shrine's pulse. Celeste knelt by the fire pit, her fingers brushing ash, her eyes dark, her grief a blade, her kin, her city, bleeding in this place. She pulled a vial from her pocket, its liquid clear, smelling of herbs and salt, a voodoo rite, her hand trembling, not with fear but resolve. A rustle came from the trees, soft, deliberate, like claws on bark, the air growing colder, thicker, pressing against their lungs. Van Helsing raised his empty pistol, his eyes scanning the shadows, catching a glint. Yellow, glowing. A single pair, not a pack, but weary, fading. A figure emerged, human, or once human, its cloak tattered, its face gaunt, its eyes yellow, then brown, human, pleading. "You killed him," it said, its voice a rasp, breaking. A woman, her claws twitching, her body trembling, as if fighting its own hunger. The air around her smelled of blood and musk, faint, fading, the scent of a beast dying, or free. Van Helsing lowered his pistol, his heart heavy, his hunter's instinct torn, hunter, healer, both at war. "The cult is done," he said, his Dutch accent thick, his eyes locked on hers, seeing humanity, not hunger. "You're free." The woman laughed, a sound like glass shattering, raw, desperate, her claws slashing the air, not to strike but to release. Her eyes brown, human, tears streaking her face, their salt sharp in the air. "Free," she gasped, her body sinking into the mud, the scent of her blood faint, human. They took everything. Celeste knelt, her vial open, its liquid poured, its scent sharp, cleansing, the fire pit's embers hissing, the smoke curling, softer now, the air lighter. The woman staggered, her claws shrinking, her face human, gaunt, her eyes empty, her life fading. "Burn it," she whispered, her hand pointing to the shrine, its beams warm, alive, its symbols pulsing. Van Helsing nodded, his fingers brushing the staff, its warmth fading, its power broken. Remy and Antoine gathered wood, their hands trembling, their wounds seeping, the scent of blood dangerous but ignored, their resolve afire. Celeste lit a torch, its flame steady, its smoke sharp, smelling of pitch and sage. They set the shrine ablaze, the flames roaring, the beams cracking, the symbols blackening, the air thick with ash and musk, the scent cleansing, final. The woman watched, her eyes brown, human, her breath shallow, her body still, the mud swallowing her knees, her blood soaking the earth, the scent faint, fading. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking, her eyes closing, her life gone, her humanity a flicker in the dark. Van Helsing knelt, his fingers brushing her hand, its warmth fading, his heart heavy, his hunter's instinct quiet, his healer's soul alive. The shrine burned, its flames bright, consuming, the swamp's hum softer, the cicadas returning, the frogs croaking, the air lighter, cleaner, the scent of ash and sage a promise of peace. They returned to the boat, the deck heavier, the water blacker, the cypress knees closer, their roots scraping the hull, the sound a groan against the swamp's hum. Remy rowed, his wounds bound, his face pale, his scar a vow, his ghost quieter now. Celeste guided, her eyes west, her vial empty, her knife sheathed, her grief a weight shared with the mud. Antoine prayed, his rosary clicking, his voice stronger, his faith battered but holding. Henri held Paul, his breaths fainter, his life a thread, the scent of his blood dangerous, final. Van Helsing sat, his pistol empty, his satchel lighter, the charm and crucifix side by side, their balance a tether to his purpose. The swamp watched, its shadows softer, its secrets buried, the howls gone, the air cleaner, the scent of ash and sage lingering, a promise of peace. They rowed on, the water glinting, its surface rippling, hiding its depths, the trees parting to reveal a wider channel, its banks softer, the mud less treacherous, the scent of rot fainter, the bayou's heart stilled. Van Helsing gripped the staff, its symbols cold, its power broken, his eyes sharp, his heart steady, his hunter's instinct quiet, his healer's soul reflecting, A hunt ended, a city saved, a cost paid in blood and grief. The swamp's silence a testament to their survival, their resolve, their humanity. The flatboat glided through the bayou's widening channel, its black water rippling under the sun's fading light. The air cooler now, carrying the scent of wet earth and faint ash from the burned shrine. Van Helsing sat at the stern, his empty pistol tucked in his satchel, its weight lighter without silver bullets, the wolfsbane jar warm but untouched, its sage scent mingling with the crucifix's cold metal. His boots, heavy with dried mud and blood, pressed against the deck, the wood creaking softly, the swamp's hum quieter, cicadas fading, frogs croaking sparsely, the splash of unseen things distant, as if the bayou exhaled, its hunger stilled. Celeste steered, her torn red dress swaying, her knife sheathed, her eyes tracing the cypress trees, their moss-draped branches swaying gently, less like ghosts now, more like weary sentinels. Remy rode, his chest and shoulder wounds bound but raw, his scar pale against his flushed face, his hands steady despite the ache, his gaze fixed on the water, his brother and cousin's losses a silent weight. Henri sat by Paul, his knife sheathed, his lantern extinguished, its oil spent, his hands gripping the deck as Paul's breaths grew fainter, his chest wound seeping through the cloth, the scent of copper, sharp, final. Father Antoine knelt beside him, his rosary clicking, his cassock stiff with dried sweat and river spray, his prayers softer, his voice hoarse, his faith a flickering light in the gathering dusk. The air pressed lighter against their skin, the humidity easing, but the taste of algae and faint blood lingered, coating their tongues, each breath a reminder of the swamp's toll. The channel curved, the cypress knees fewer, their roots no longer scraping the hull, the water smoother, its surface reflecting the sky's bruised purple and gold. Van Helsing's mind turned, his hunter's instinct quiet, his healer's soul heavy. The leader's plea, I give strength, eternity. A shadow beside the woman's final whisper, her humanity a cost paid in blood. The charm in his pocket was warm, its sage scent grounding, but the carved staff, its symbols cold, lay beside him, a relic of the cult's broken power. He glanced at Celeste, her face etched with grief, her eyes distant, seeing kin lost to the swamp's hunger, her resolve a fire that burned without flame. Remy broke the silence, his voice low, rough, his Creole accent thick. Will it end? He asked, his eyes on Van Helsing, searching his scar a map of loss. The loup-garou, are they gone? Van Helsing met his gaze, his grey eyes steady, his Dutch accent heavy. The cult is broken, he said, his voice calm, measured, but his heart weighed the truth. Luke's transformation, the woman's claws, the leader's healing wounds. But the swamp keeps its secrets. Remy nodded, his hands tightening on the oars, the wood groaning, his face set, his grief a vow to live, to carry his ghosts home. Celeste pointed to a bank, her hand steady, her voice soft but firm. We rest here, she said, her eyes on a clearing where the mud was firm, the trees sparse, their branches free of carved symbols, the air cleaner smelling of earth and faint jasmine, not blood. The boat nudged the bank, its hull scraping softly, the ground solid under their boots, less treacherous, the scent of rot fainter. They stepped ashore, Henri carrying Paul, his body limp, his breath shallow, his face grey, the scent of his blood a warning they couldn't heed. They laid him on a patch of grass, its blades cool, damp, smelling of life, not decay, a fragile comfort. Antoine knelt, his rosary pressed to Paul's chest, his prayers a rhythm, his voice breaking, his eyes wet, his faith battered by the swamp's cruelty. He's slipping, he whispered, his hands trembling, the rosary beads catching the dusk's light, their clicker heartbeat against the silence. Celeste knelt beside him, her fingers brushing Paul's brow, her eyes dark, her grief a weight shared with the earth. She pulled a small pouch from her dress, its leather worn, smelling of herbs and salt, a voodoo rite. Her hands steady, her voice low, chanting softly, the words foreign to Van Helsing but heavy with intent, the air warming, the scent of sage rising, faint but cleansing. Van Helsing watched, his heart heavy, his healer's soul alive, his hunter's instinct quiet. He thought of Amsterdam, of patients lost to fever, of battles fought in the dark, of Dracula's castle, its shadows a mirror to this swamp's heart. Paul's breath slowed, his chest stilling, the scent of his blood fading, his life gone, the air lighter, the swamp's hum softer, as if it mourned or released. Henry cursed, his voice low, his hands clenched, his face pale, his grief a blade. Paul, his kin, another ghost in the mud. Remy stood, his wounds seeping, his scar stark, his eyes on the water, his resolve a fire that burned without words. They buried Paul under a cypress, its roots gentle, its bark smooth, the earth soft, yielding, smelling of life, not worms. Van Helsing dug, his hands raw, the mud cool, the scent grounding, his heart steady, his thoughts on the living, Celeste, Antoine, Remy, Henri, their survival a testament to their strength, their humanity. Celeste placed her pouch in the grave, its herbs a blessing, the air warming, the scent of sage and salt a promise of peace. Antoine prayed, his rosary clicking, his voice stronger, his faith a light in the dark. Remy and Henri stood, their knives sheathed, their wounds bound, their faces set, their grief a vow to return, to live. The dusk deepened, the sky a bruise of purple and black, the stars faint, the air cooler, cleaner, the scent of jasmine stronger, the swamp's pulse slower, its hunger stilled. They returned to the boat, its deck lighter without Paul, the water smoother, its surface reflecting the sky's fading light. Remy rowed, his hands steady, his wounds raw, his scar a vow, his ghost quieter, their weight shared with the group. Celeste steered, her eyes ahead, her grief a fire that burned without consuming, her resolve a guide through the bayou's maze. Antoine sat, his rosary still, his prayers silent, his faith battered but holding, his eyes on the water, seeing Paul, seeing grace. Van Helsing sat, his satchel lighter, the staff beside him, its symbols cold, its power gone, the charm and crucifix a balance of worlds, his heart reflecting. Hunter, healer, both at peace, for now. The swamp had taken much, leaves, kin, faith, but it had given something too, a bond forged in blood and mud, a humanity that survived the dark. He thought of New Orleans, its gaslit streets, its people, their hands blistered, their faces gaunt, their eyes wary but alive, their city waiting, its pulse a call to return, to heal. The channel widened further, the trees thinning, their moss sparser, the air cleaner, the scent of river mud and fish rising, faint but familiar, a sign of the city's edge. A bird called, its cry soft, answered by another, the swamp's hum fading, the water's lap gentler, the dusk's light softer, the sky opening, the stars brighter. They rowed on, the boat steady, the water smooth, the bayou shadows receding, its secrets buried, the scent of ash and sage lingering, a promise of peace. Van Helsing gripped the staff, his eyes sharp, his heart calm, the hunt ended, the healer's work begun, the city's lights a distant glow, a beacon through the dark guiding them home. The flatboat drifted into the Mississippi's current, its black water merging with the river's broader flow, the city's pulse a steady hum, steamboats whistling, dock workers shouting, the clatter of carts on cobblestones. Van Helsing sat at the stern, his satchel light, the empty pistol tucked inside, The wolfsbane jar warm but untouched, its sage scent faint beside the crucifix's cold silver. His boots, crusted with swamp mud and blood, pressed against the deck, the wood creaking softly, the air cool, carrying the scent of river mud and fish, a trace of New Orleans life stirring in the dusk's purple and gold. Celeste steered, her torn red dress swaying, her knife sheathed, her eyes fixed on the horizon where gaslights flickered, their amber glow a beacon through the fading light. Remy rode, his chest and shoulder wounds bound but raw, his scar pale against his flushed face, his hands steady, his ghosts, brother, cousin, quiet now, their weight eased by survival. Henri sat beside the empty space where Paul had lain, his knife sheathed, his face etched with grief, his resolve a silent vow. Father Antoine clutched his rosary, its beads clicking, his cassock stiff with dried sweat and river spray, his prayers silent, his faith a steady light in the city's nearing glow. The swamp's hum was gone, its cicadas silent, its frogs still. The splash of unseen things faded, as if the bayou exhaled, its secrets buried with the cult's ashes. The air pressed lighter, the humidity softening, but the taste of algae and faint blood lingered, coating their tongues, a reminder of the cost paid. The river widened, its surface rippling with the city's pulse, the trees thinning, their moss sparse, the scent of jasmine and smoke rising sharp, alive. The docks loomed, their planks warped, smelling of tar and brine, their edges littered with fish bones, their gleam faint in the dusk, the city's scars a mirror to its hope. Van Helsing's mind turned, his hunter's instinct stilled, his healer's soul heavy, the cult leader's plea, I give strength, eternity. A shadow beside Luke's yellow eyes, Paul's still face, the woman's final whisper. The charm in his pocket was warm, its sage scent grounding, but the carved staff, its symbols cold, lay beside him, a relic of a hunt ended, its power broken. He glanced at Celeste, her face resolute, her eyes seeing kin lost but a city saved, her strength a fire that burned without flame. The river carried them closer, the gaslights brighter, their glow slicing through the dusk, revealing New Orleans' heart, its alleys narrow, its people weary, their hands blistered, their faces gaunt, their eyes alive with defiance, hope. They stepped onto the dock, the wood groaning under their boots, the air thick with the scent of spilled rum, cook fires burning crab and okra, the sour tang of decay in the gutters. A banjo wailed nearby, its notes sharp, mournful, curling through the streets like a prayer answered. Celeste led, her steps sure, her red dress a vivid slash against the cobblestones, slick with mud and liquor. Remy and Henri followed, their wounds raw, their knives sheathed, their faces set, their grief a weight carried home, their survival a vow kept. Antoine trailed, his rosary silent, his eyes on the church spire rising above the rooftops, its cross glinting in the gaslight, a beacon for his battered faith, now whole. The French Quarter's buildings leaned close, their balconies sagging, dripping with ferns that brushed Van Helsing's hat. The air tasted of smoke and sweat, the heat gentler, a whisper of the swamp's grip released. Crowds moved, fishers hauling nets, washwomen with red hands, children clutching charms, their eyes wide but unafraid, the cult's shadow gone. The city lived, its pulse strong, its scars deep, yellow fever lurking, hunger gnawing, but hope louder, in the laughter from a tavern, the clink of glasses, the rhythm of life unbroken, resilient. They reached the church, its oak door groaning as Antoine pushed it open, the air inside cool, heavy with beeswax and musty hymnals. The stained glass saints glowed, their colours, reds like blood, blues like bruises, fractured across the stone floor, softer now, less like wounds. Van Helsing's boots echoed, his satchel light, the staff inside, its symbols cold, a relic to be locked away, not burned. Antoine knelt at the altar, his rosary clicking, his voice rising, a prayer of thanks, his faith a flame rekindled, steady, bright. Celeste stood by a pew, her fingers tracing a faded scratch, clawed, harmless now, her eyes wet, her grief for her kin a fire that burned for the living, the city's soul. Remy and Henri sat, their wounds healing, their scars. Remy's on his cheek, Henri's in his heart, a map of survival, a testament to their strength. "We live," Remy said, his Creole accent thick, his scar still, his voice steady, his ghosts at rest, his hands ready for nets, for life. Henri nodded, his grief for Paul a weight shared, his resolve a fire that burned without words, his eyes on the altar, seeing hope, not loss. Van Helsing stood, his grey eyes tracing the saints, their solemn gaze a mirror to his own. Hunter, healer, both at peace. The candles flickered, their wax pooling, their scent grounding, a contrast to the swamp's decay, a promise of light. Celeste spoke, her voice soft, her Creole accent curling through the silence. "The city breathes free," she said, her eyes meeting Van Helsing's, her grief a blade dulled by victory, her resolve a shield for her people. She placed a charm on the altar, leather, worn, smelling of sage and salt. Beside Antoine's cross, their balance a testament to New Orleans' heart. Catholic, voodoo, human, alive. Van Helsing nodded, his fingers brushing the crucifix, its silver cold, his faith tempered by blood, his healer's soul ascendant, his hunter's work done, the cult's shadow lifted, the missing mourned, their names a weight he'd carry always. They left the church, the night air cool, the gaslights flickering, their amber glow weaving through the streets, the city's pulse vibrant, music, laughter, the clatter of carts, the hum of life reborn. The cobblestones gleamed, slick with evening dew, the alleys softer, their shadows kind, the scent of jasmine and smoke a cleansing breath. Van Helsing walked to the dock, the river's hum steady, its water reflecting the stars bright now, the sky clear, the air clean, the scent of fish and tar a grounding weight. Celeste stood beside him, her red dress swaying, her grief a fire banked, her city her home, her strength her legacy. Remy and Henri followed, their scars a vow, their lives a promise to fish, to heal, to live. Antoine stayed at the church door, his rosary silent, his faith a beacon, his eyes on the city, seeing grace in its scars. Van Helsing boarded a steamboat, its deck steady, its whistle sharp, the river calling, its current strong carrying him forward. He looked back, the city's gaslights aglow, its people a pulse, their survival a testament to their humanity, their hope a fire that burned brighter than the swamp's dark. The hunt was over, the cult broken, the city free, its scars deep, its soul deeper. He gripped the rail, his satchel light, his heart steady, his healer's work endless, his hunter's legacy a light in the dark, New Orleans stars a guide for the road ahead. That's our tale tonight, listeners. Whisper your thoughts across the night, from Tokyo's twilight to Cairo's restless midnight to New York's quiet dawn. If shadows speak to you, subscribe and keep your lanterns burning. Rest well. Until next time.